I had 58 years of applied mathematics in my head when I died. Not the kind that fills a classroom whiteboard. The kind that describes how systems fail, how resources flow, how probability bends when you understand the variables, and everyone else is guessing. I died at my desk, reviewing a paper on economic collapse modeling. My heart stopped between one sentence and the next. The paper was good. I never found out if it was accepted. Then stone. Cold stone beneath me, a ceiling of rough timber above, the smell of old wool and something burning that wasn't quite wood. My hands were wrong. Small, thin-wristed, the hands of a child who had spent his years indoors. I tried to sit up and managed it on the second attempt, which told me the body was weak but functional. I looked at the room, stone walls, rushes on the floor, a single window shuttered, a candle burning on a table with 3 legs and one that had been repaired with different wood. The repair was recent. New wood against old stone. Someone was running out of money for furniture. I filed that. 14 years of another life settled into me the way water fills a low place. Aldrich Varen. Third son of Lord Edric Varen of the Eastern March. Youngest, smallest, dismissed early as the one who would not matter. His mother had died 2 winters ago. His father had stopped sleeping in his own bed sometime after that. His eldest brother Casimir had already begun behaving as though the inheritance was not a future event but a present one. His second brother, Reynold, had gone to serve in a border garrison and sent money home every 3 months, which was more useful than anything Casimir had managed. Aldrich had been sick for 2 of his 14 years, not seriously. The persistent, grinding kind of illness that does not kill but costs. Wood for fires, medicine from the village apothecary, a physician from the market town twice, which had each time cost more than the estate could comfortably spend. I lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and took inventory. What I had. 14 years of Aldrich's memories, which meant I knew every person in the household by name and history. I knew the estate's layout from years of wandering it during recovery. I knew the family's situation in the vague way a child understands adult trouble. Too much owed, not enough coming in. Visitors who left my father looking older than when they arrived. I also had 58 years of accumulated knowledge from a life spent studying how numbers describe the world. Economics, statistics, accounting, engineering principles. The mathematics of optimization, probability, resource allocation, and the specific behavior of systems under stress. What I did not have. The ability to walk into a room and be taken seriously by anyone over 30. A body with any physical strength, political or social standing, money. A plan that anyone else would recognize as a plan until it was already working. I started the plan that afternoon. The first thing I needed was information. Real information, not Aldrich's childhood impressions. I needed the estate's actual numbers, what it owed, what it owned, what it produced, and what it cost to produce it. The estate's record-keeping was handled by Petra. She had been with the Varen household for 11 years, arriving as a young woman hired to copy documents, and staying because she was the only person on the estate who understood what the documents said. She was 31, precise, underappreciated, given a room in the East Wing and a salary that had not increased in 4 years, despite the fact that she had, in that time, taken on responsibilities that should have required 3 people. I found her in the record room, which was also the room where documents went when someone did not know where else to put them. She was copying a land survey onto fresh parchment because the original was crumbling at the edges. She did not look up when I came. Lord Aldrich. She had the voice of someone who had learned to state facts without inflection to avoid having them disputed. You should be resting. I've been resting for 2 years. I sat down across from her. I want to see the household accounts, all of them. Everything that tracks what we owe and what comes in. She looked up then. Something in her face that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. My father doesn't look at them anymore. Casimir looks at them once and stops when the numbers are unpleasant. I paused. I want to look at all of them. She set down her pen. She looked at me for a moment, with the expression of someone deciding whether this was a problem or an opportunity. Then, she stood and went to the shelves. She gave me everything. 7 years of household accounts, the estate's land survey, the debt record, The grain tallies, the payroll. She stacked them on the table in front of me and returned to her copying without another word. I read for 3 hours. The situation was worse than I had understood from Aldrich's impressions, and better than it looked at first pass. Those were two different things. Both were true. Worse, the estate owed 4,200 gold to Count Morvain, who held the consolidated debt accumulated over 9 years of bad harvests, 3 repairs to the main house that should have cost a third of what they did, and 2 loans taken to fund Casimir's introduction to court that had produced no return. Current income was approximately 300 gold per year, from rents, grain sales, and timber rights. Current expenses, including debt service, were 540. The gap was 240 gold per year. At that rate, Morvain would own the estate within 4 years, regardless of what the family did. He had been patient because patience was cheaper than forcing a bankruptcy. Patient men who hold debt like that are not being generous. They are being precise. Better, the estate's land was underperforming. Not slightly, substantially. The grain yields on the south fields were running at 60% of what the soil quality and available water should produce. The mill was processing grain at roughly 45% of its mechanical capacity. The timber rights were being sold at a fixed rate negotiated 8 years ago that was now 40% below market. 3 of the estate's 7 tenant farms were paying rents set during a period of higher grain prices. Rents that now made no economic sense for the estate, which was getting less than market value, or for the tenants, who were paying in grain when cash would have suited everyone better. These were not catastrophes. They were inefficiencies. Inefficiencies can be corrected. I closed the last ledger. Petra was still at her desk, still copying, her handwriting unchanged from hour 1 to hour 3. When was the last time anyone else sat and read all of those? I said, a pause in her writing. I don't believe anyone has read all of them since I organized them 4 years ago. The mill lease, the clause in Section 3, Paragraph 2. Is that the current operating agreement? She put down her pen. Yes. It caps the miller's profit share at 8% of output, regardless of efficiency improvements he makes to the mechanism. Yes. So, if the miller improves the mill and doubles output, he still receives 8% of the original projected output. Not 8% of what he actually produces. She was quiet for a moment. That is correct. He knows this. Oswin has known it for 3 years. Her voice had shifted slightly. Not toward warmth, toward something more like recognition. He stopped making improvements when he understood the terms. I filed Oswin under, useful, currently without incentive, correctable. Face slap number 1 arrived the next morning, and it came from Casimir. He was 22 and built with the breadth of a man who had trained for fighting and the expression of one who had found it insufficient as a life plan. He was not cruel in the way of men who enjoy cruelty. He was dismissive in the way of men who have decided the hierarchy is fixed, and anyone outside their tier is not worth the energy of active contempt. He found me in the great hall with the debt ledger open on the table. He looked at the ledger. He looked at me. He pulled out the chair across from mine and sat down and put his hand flat on the ledger's cover. Father has already reviewed the debt situation, he said. The father reviewed it 2 years ago and stopped. The numbers have changed. The numbers don't know that. I met his eyes. The mill lease is costing us 60 gold per year against market rate. The Southfield yield gap is costing approximately 90. The timber rights are 50 below current prices. That's 200 gold per year. We're losing to 3 correctable problems before we touch the debt itself. He looked at me for a long moment. The expression of a man recalibrating something he hadn't expected to need to recalibrate. You've been sick for 2 years, and he said, I've been in bed. I can still read. He stood up. He didn't take the ledger. He said, Don't bother father with this. He has enough to carry. Then he left. He was not wrong about father. He was not right about what that meant. I let it sit for 2 days. Then I went to find Oswin. The mill was a 20-minute walk east of the main house, set where the tributary came down from the ridge with enough fall to drive a wheel reliably from late winter through summer. The building was sound. Old timber, the good kind, dry and settled. The wheel was turning slowly when I arrived. Oswin was in the yard beside it, doing nothing with the precise quality of a man who had learned not to do things that don't benefit him. He was 53, built like someone who had spent 30 years lifting sacks and repairing mechanisms with whatever material was available. the calloused hands and good mechanical instincts of a man who understood how things worked without having the vocabulary to explain it. He watched me cross the yard without surprise. "But Lord Aldrich," a pause, "and you're walking better." "I'm feeling better." I looked at the wheel. The paddle geometry was inefficient, visible even from a distance. The angle of entry into the water was losing force from the current rather than using it. Correctable. But not the first conversation. "The mill lease," I said. He said nothing. "The clause that caps your profit share at 8% of projected baseline output, regardless of improvements you make." Still nothing. His expression did not change. "And I want to renegotiate it." He looked at me then. Really looked. The way a careful man examines something he suspects might be a trap. "The young lord does not negotiate leases," he said. "That is your father's—" "My father's steward will write whatever agreement we reach, and my father will sign it because his steward will tell him it improves estate income." I met his eyes. "I need to know what you would do with the mill if your profit grew with what you produced." A long silence. The wheel turned, water moved. The paddle angle," he said finally, his voice lower. "I could reset it. Increase the bite from the current by maybe a third. The bearing on the main shaft is wearing. I've been letting it wear because replacing it costs 40 silver for my share, and the return wasn't worth it under the current terms. The grain chute has a bottleneck at the lower section I could rebuild in 3 days if I had the stone." He paused. "I've been looking at it for 2 years. That's how much would output increase if you addressed all three?" He thought, not performing thought, actually calculating. 60%. Maybe 70 if the bearing changes as clean as I think. A 60% increase in mill output. The downstream effect on what we could sell rather than lose to spoilage was substantial. I had the numbers already. I'd spent the previous evening working through them. "New terms," I said, like 12% of actual output, no cap. Your improvements are your investment. The estate provides materials for the bearing and the stone for the chute rebuild. You provide the labor. Any further improvements you fund yourself at 12% of whatever they generate." He looked at me for a moment, then, "Your father will agree to this." "In principle, yes." Another pause. He looked at the wheel, at the paddle angle that had been wrong for 2 years, at the bearing he had watched wear down, while calculating whether it was worth fixing. "Monday," he said. "I start Monday." The new lease was signed on a Friday. My father's steward, a thin man named Kale, who had worked for the family for 16 years, read through it twice, made one small correction to the payment schedule, and presented it to my father that afternoon. My father signed it. He asked Kale who had arranged the terms. Kale said Lord Aldrich had proposed them and that they appeared sound. My father looked toward where I was standing at the back of the room. He didn't say anything, neither did I. By the end of the 3rd week, the mill's output had increased by 54%, not 60%. Oswin's estimate had been optimistic on the bearing improvement, which turned out to require a different replacement than expected. He had corrected for it midway through and arrived at 54% anyway, through a further adjustment to the paddle geometry that he had not mentioned in our initial conversation, because he had been working it out while he talked to me. I did not point this out. I noted it in the secondary ledger I had started keeping, not the estate's official accounts, but a personal record on blank pages at the back of an old survey map. Oswin makes independent improvements beyond what he states. File as reliable variable. Adjust all projections upward. The Southfield problem was older and harder. 200 hectares of cultivation on the estate's southern boundary were producing 60% of their yield potential because the eastern third sat above the reliable water table. In dry summers, which occurred 3 years in every 5 in this region, the eastern parcels failed almost completely. The families farming them knew this. They planted anyway because they had no other land to work. They paid their rents in grain, which in bad years meant they paid barely enough to meet obligation and had almost nothing left for themselves, which meant their labor in the following year was diminished, which meant the following year's yield was also reduced. A compounding problem running for a generation without anyone connecting the terms. The river was 400 meters west. The elevation drop from the western bank to the eastern parcels was 2.5 meters over that distance. A natural slope, gentle, entirely suited to gravity-fed irrigation channels. I walked it with Oswin on a morning in the 5th week. He brought a wooden level he had made himself and took readings every 20 meters while I noted the numbers. The slope was consistent, no surprises. The channel could be cut with a crew of 10 men in 6 weeks. using stone from a partial collapse in the estate's north quarry that had been producing nothing for 4 years because the collapsed section blocked access to the working face. Opening the quarry was not optional. It was the source of material for everything else on the list. I brought the full proposal to my father on a Tuesday morning. He was in his study. He had the look he had worn for 2 years. A man managing something heavy by keeping very still. He was 51 and looked 63. He listened to everything without interrupting. The mill improvement numbers first. The Southfield yield gap. The irrigation proposal. The quarry access, cost, and timeline. He said, "Where does the money come from to clear the quarry?" The mill income increase covers the quarry crew wages in the first 6 weeks. The quarry then produces stone for the irrigation channels, which we pay for in labor credit against tenant rent obligations, rather than cash. After that, the yield improvement generates income that repays the startup cost within 1 growing season. He looked at the numbers I had placed in front of him. His eyes moved slowly. He was not a stupid man. He had been a good administrator once, before the debt accumulated faster than he could address it. "You've been reading the ledgers," he said. Casimir said you were asking questions." Casimir doesn't like the questions. A silence. "No." He looked at the window. Casimir wants to manage the decline carefully. He thinks the estate is going to Morvain eventually, and he's trying to negotiate his position before it does. He said it without bitterness, just as information. He's not wrong that Morvain is patient. Morvain is patient because patience is working, I said. If we remove the income gap, patience stops working for him. My father looked at the papers for a long time. Then he called for Kale. Face slap number 2 arrived 6 weeks after that, and it came from outside the estate. Morvain's steward arrived on a Wednesday with a formal letter and the posture of a man delivering something he expected to be unanswerable. The letter cited a clause in the original debt agreement, Section 9, which I had read 4 times in the first week and had been waiting to become relevant. The clause allowed Morvain to demand early reassessment of the estate's financial position if improvements to estate operations altered the collateral value by more than 15%. The mill improvement and the Southfield project, word of which had apparently reached Morvain through channels I had not yet identified, had triggered his calculation. He was not demanding immediate repayment. He was demanding an audit, his auditor, his man, reviewing the estate's books and producing a new valuation on which he would base a revised repayment structure. His revised structure would be designed to extract the maximum his lawyers could justify from our new income before we had time to build any reserve. Kyle read the letter and went pale. My father read it and went still. Casimir read it and made a sound somewhere between satisfaction and despair. The sound of a man who's been predicting the apocalypse and is not entirely unhappy to be proven right. I read it twice and started calculating. Morvain's clause was real. I had known it was there. What I had also known from reading the original debt agreement more carefully than anyone in the household had apparently read it was that Section 9 contained a reciprocal provision. If the debtor requested reassessment, Morvain's auditor had authority. If Morvain demanded reassessment, the debtor had the right to appoint a co-auditor with equal standing whose findings would be averaged with Morvain's man in the final valuation. The clause had been written by a lawyer working for my grandfather, who had apparently been more careful than the subsequent generation in reading what he negotiated. No one in the household knew it was there. I knew because I had read every line of every document in the record room, I told Petra. She read the section I indicated. She read it again. She set the document down in the careful way she set things down when she was thinking hard. A co-auditor, she said. With equal standing, their findings averaged. Where do we find a co-auditor? There's a man in the market town, Harlan. He does assessments for merchant disputes, trained in the capital, worked estates for 12 years before setting up independently. I had found the reference in a letter in the record room, 3 years old, written to my father by a neighbor who had used Harlan's services in a boundary dispute. He's expensive, 40 gold for a full estate valuation. We have 22 gold in the strongbox. The mill generated 16 gold last month. If I restructure 2 of the rent agreements to cash payment at current grain prices, better for the tenants and better for us, we free up another 20 gold within 4 weeks. She looked at me with the expression she had been developing over 6 weeks. Not quite trust. A working hypothesis that was holding up to testing. That's still not 40. 36, collected in 4 weeks. Harlan will start for 30, and receive the remaining 10 from the first month of his valuation period. I paused. I've already written to him. She was quiet for a moment. You wrote to him before you knew Morvain was going to invoke the clause. I wrote to him the day I read Section 9. She picked up her pen. I'll draft the formal response to Morvain's steward. Harlan arrived 12 days later, a compact man in his mid-40s with the specific economy of movement of someone who has spent years working in small spaces full of documents. He brought his own ink, his own notation system, and a set of questions he began asking before he had removed his traveling coat. He spent 3 days with the accounts. On the 4th day, 4 hours in the fields with Oswin. On the 5th day, he came to find me in the record room. He sat down. He put his notes on the table. You've read all of these, he said, not a question. You're 14. The accounts don't know that either. Something shifted in his expression. The recalibration of a professional who has encountered something outside, expected parameters, and is deciding what to do with it. The mill valuation, he said. I'm reading it as an improvement of 63% on the base lease value. Morvain's man will try to value it lower. He'll call the improvement temporary. Argue it depends on Oswin's continued cooperation. Oswin's lease runs for 12 years. It's in writing. Morvain's own steward witnessed it as a courtesy when my father signed. I had made sure of that. It is not temporary. Harlan made a note. The Southfield irrigation. It's not complete. 60% complete. The remaining 40% will be finished before Morvain's audit window closes. I have the crew schedule. I put it on the table. He looked at it. He looked at the mill numbers. He looked at the rent restructuring I had done, which had increased cash flow by 19 gold per month at no cost to the tenants who were now paying in currency rather than grain at prices that had suited neither party. What is your projection for annual income at the end of the current improvement cycle? He said. I had run the calculation 4 times. 470 to 510 gold per year, depending on harvest variance. Up from 300. Expenses remain at approximately 320 after the debt service adjustment. I paused. The income gap reverses. We start building a reserve. Harlan wrote for a moment. Then, carefully, Morvain is going to argue that the estate's improved position justifies accelerated repayment. He'll use the audit to set a new schedule that extracts the improvement gains before they can compound. He can argue it. The debt agreement's repayment clause is fixed at current terms unless both parties consent to revision. I had this from the same Section 9 that had revealed the co-auditor provision. He cannot unilaterally alter the schedule. He can request renegotiation. I will decline. He'll apply pressure through other means. Yes. I'd been thinking about this for 3 weeks. He'll want to look like a reasonable man. He has a reputation in the region. Forcing a family into bankruptcy through legal maneuver after they've demonstrably improved their position costs him socially, which costs him commercially. He'll threaten, calculate the cost of following through, and accept current terms with a small renegotiated grace period to save face. Harlan looked at me for a long moment. You've been modeling his behavior. I've been modeling everyone's behavior. It's what the numbers are for. Morvain's auditor arrived 2 weeks later. His name was Cedric. Thorough, humorless, and he spent the first day trying to find documentation inconsistencies that were not present, because Petra had organized the record room with a precision that made Cedric's work look approximate in comparison. He and Harlan produced their findings separately over 6 days. The averaging clause was applied. Cedric's valuation was predictably low on the mill improvement and the incomplete irrigation system. Harlan's was accurate on both. The average landed 31 gold above where Cedric had wanted it, not a transformative number. Enough to change the debt ratio calculation in a direction that made Morvain's accelerated repayment argument mathematically weak. Morvain's lawyer presented the revised demand 14 days after the audit closed. It was worded as a proposal. It asked for a 400 gold advance against the improved income projection. I declined. 1 page. The repayment schedule as currently agreed would be maintained. The Southfield improvements were not available as additional collateral under the terms of the existing agreement, which I cited with section and paragraph. The estate was in compliance with all current obligations. The response from Morvain's side took 10 days. Another proposal. 300 gold. I declined again. 1 week later, a letter from Morvain personally. Formally worded, professionally courteous, and containing between its lines the specific frustration of a patient man who has discovered his patience is no longer producing the result he calibrated it for. He proposed a meeting. My father came to my room that evening. He knocked, which he had not done before. He sat in the chair by the window, the same chair where Aldrich had spent 2 years recovering, and looked at the projection table I was working on. "Morvain wants to meet," he said. "Yes." "He wants to negotiate. He wants to see who he's been dealing with." I set down the pen. "He's been receiving responses from Kale and Harlan. He hasn't understood that the decisions are coming from somewhere else." Father looked at me. Something in his face I hadn't seen in this life before. Not the resigned stillness of the past 2 years. Something more complicated. "He's going to sit across from a 14-year-old, he said. "Yes, and he's going to have to decide what to do with that." I paused. "What he does will tell us what kind of man he actually is." Morvain arrived on a Thursday. A large man, not physically, but in the way of men who have held authority long enough that their presence carries weight independent of their size. Gray at the temples, the composed expression of someone who has sat at many tables and has rarely been surprised by what he found. He sat down in the great hall with 2 of his men. My father sat across from him. I sat beside my father, which was not where Morvain had expected me to be. He looked at me. He looked at my father. Something recalibrated behind his eyes. "Nay, Lord Varen." He meant my father. Then, after a pause 1 second too long, "And Lord Aldrich." "Count Morvain," I said. "Thank you for coming." He turned to look at me more directly. He had the expression of a man who has received many letters signed with a name, built a model of the person behind that name, and is now finding the model requires significant revision. "You've been busy," he said. "The estate has been busy. I've mostly been reading." A pause. "At the mill. Oswin's improvement. We provided materials. He provided the engineering. The irrigation. Common sense given the field layout and the river position." He looked at me for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he almost smiled. Not warmth. The specific expression of a man who has encountered something he finds professionally interesting. "The co-auditor clause," he said. "My lawyers didn't catch it. Your grandfather's lawyers wrote it. In your interest as a debtor protection provision as much as ours." "I'm not the debtor." "No, but the principle is sound. Clauses like that build confidence in contracts generally. Worth keeping in agreements you intend to use repeatedly." He looked at me for a moment longer. Then at my father, who had been sitting very still. Then back at me. "What do you want from this meeting?" he said. "The current repayment terms maintained. No additional collateral requests. In exchange, I want to discuss the timber rights." He raised an eyebrow. "The rate we're selling at is 40% below current market. That gap exists because the agreement was written 8 years ago, and the market moved. You hold the debt. You have an interest in us generating maximum income. We're leaving 80 gold per year on the table under the current timber terms. If we renegotiate to reflect current prices, the estate generates more income, services the debt more effectively, and Morvain Holdings recovers its principal faster." He was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to help you generate income so you can pay me back sooner. I'm pointing out that it also benefits you. The math is straightforward." Another pause. He looked at his hands, then the window, then at me. The timber rate was set at a discount because the previous negotiation was done under financial stress. Your father needed liquidity. He paid for it with a long-term income reduction. Yes, I read the negotiation record. The situation has changed. The stress is lower. The rate should reflect that." Morvain sat back. He had the expression of a man completing a calculation. "What's your proposed new rate?" "Current market minus 5%. Not parity. You brought capital when we needed it. That earns a discount, but a sustainable one. Current minus 5 generates an additional 72 gold per year. Against the debt service, the estate becomes current faster. You recover the principal in 11 years instead of 16. He said nothing for a moment, then 14 years. 13. Current minus 8%, 13 years. I had run this scenario. The difference between 5 and 8 was 11 gold per year. 11 gold per year over 13 years was 143 gold. Against a 4,000 gold debt. A rounding error on a negotiated settlement. Not the number that mattered." "Agreed," I said. Morvain looked at me for a long moment, then at my father, then back at me. "You're going to be very irritating," he said, not unkindly. "I'm told that's a family trait." My father made a sound. It took me a moment to identify it. He was laughing. quietly, not a performance of it. Just the sound itself. Escaping from somewhere it had been kept for 2 years. Morven signed the timber amendment at the end of the meeting. Petra had the copy filed before evening. I sat in the record room after they left and ran the numbers again. They held. Estate income, projected end of year 1 at current trajectory, 460 gold. Expenses, including revised debt service at the new timber rate, 315. Surplus, 145 gold. The first surplus this estate had produced in 6 years. It was not enough, it was a beginning. The team at the end of month 6. Oswin was in the mill every day, running at 71% of mechanical capacity, producing notes about a second wheel he wanted to propose. I had asked him to cost it before raising it formally. He had the cost ready 3 days before I asked. Petra had taken on 2 of the older tenant farmers' daughters as assistant scribes, which she had not asked permission for. When I asked her about it, she said she needed the capacity and they needed the income, and the cost was covered by the efficiency gain in her own work. I told her to continue and to keep track of the cost in her secondary ledger. She had started keeping a secondary ledger without being asked. I had noticed 2 months ago and had not mentioned it. Some things were better observed than commented on. The south field irrigation was complete. Friedrich, who had farmed the eastern parcel for 23 years, had stood at the channel opening on the day we first let the water through and had not said anything for a long time. Then he said, 23 years? Nobody saw this? I said, the slope was always there. It just needed the channel. He went back to his field. The next week's soil reports showed moisture levels not recorded in the estate documents for a decade. Casimir had not spoken to me in 4 weeks, not from hostility, or not only that, from the specific discomfort of a man who has organized his understanding of the world around a fixed hierarchy and has found one of the elements has moved without permission. He would adjust. People generally did when the alternative was refusing to acknowledge numbers. My father had started coming to my room in the evenings. Not every evening, 3 or 4 times a week. He sat in the chair by the window. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes he just sat there while I worked. He had started sleeping in his own room again. I noted this and said nothing about it. Some inventories were better kept privately. What we had now, 6 months in, 145 gold of projected annual surplus. The first in 6 years. A mill producing at 71% and moving toward 80. South fields irrigated and beginning their first full productive season. Timber rights renegotiated, adding 72 gold per year. 2 scribes in training. A debt that was real and large, but was no longer accelerating toward us faster than we could run. What we did not have yet. Enough. The surplus was real, but thin. 1 bad harvest, 1 unexpected repair, 1 new cost would erase it. Morvain's patience had been recalibrated but not exhausted. The estate's population had not grown. We had 80 families. The projects waiting on the list required 120. I wrote the next phase in the evening in the back of the survey map ledger. A settlement offer for new tenant families. Terms designed to attract people from estates within 40 kilometers where conditions were demonstrably worse. Clean water. The estate's wells were sound, and I had started a documentation project with Petra to prove it. Written contracts, fixed rents, a school for children. The school was not optional. It was an investment with a 14-year payoff. The children of the families we attracted now would be the people running the estate's more complex operations in a decade. Oswin's instincts were extraordinary, and he was 53. The south field work required someone who could read a survey and calculate a slope. There were currently 3 people on the estate who could do both. I needed 30. Mathematics describes how systems behave, but only if you understand the variables. The variables here were people. People had patterns, just like fields and mills and river slopes. Once you understood the pattern, the rest was calculation. I picked up my pen and kept working.